I'm Dr. Jack Miller. I want to thank the library, the Astoria Library, and Suzanne, who organized this, for having me here. This very library is where a substantial portion of the research for this talk, and for my book, which I'll talk about in a minute, was done right in there on the microfilm machine, which for a person my age, I'm 54 years old, I went to college in the 1980s. I was a philosophy major and a history minor. I did my history thesis research largely on microfiche machines, and I had to feed dimes into it to print it out. Here, I was able to print and then just pay up front, which was actually a kind of a technological advance for me. So the research here went a little more smoothly. There is a certain dying art to the microfilm and the microfiche. I was able to do an awful lot of the research, sort of secondary research on the internet, and you'll see a few slides from things that I actually couldn't believe were on the internet. For example, a page from the 1924 issue of the Concrete Highway magazine, which is a thing, and that exists only on the internet. I'm sure it's somewhere in real person. I would be able to find it. Thank you for coming out, and this is a rare sunny Saturday in Astoria, so I appreciate you giving it over to me. I want to situate myself with regards to the talk today, just so you know sort of where I'm coming from. This is kind of standard in history and political science these days, is to talk about what my perspective is. I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD in political science. I teach American politics and political philosophy at Portland State University. So I'm not a professional historian, but I am also a historical novelist, and I will talk about my novel a little bit, not much. For some people came on Thursday for the reading. I've also been a freelance writer throughout much of my adult life, which is where a lot of the research for this came from. And I'm also a podcaster. I have a podcast called The Pothole Problem, Making Sense of Political Outrage. I'm an expert in American politics. I think that I'm a sort of an amateur at political outrage, becoming an expert. And I'm definitely I would say a decently amateurish sort of Golden Gloves level historian. So what I will do towards the end of this talk and throughout a little bit is I will bring my political scientist perspective on this topic. But I was trained as an undergraduate in historical research, so I'm going to try really hard not to make any factual mistakes, and I will attempt absolutely not to lie at all. Okay, so where did all this come from? The fire, which was almost 100 years ago, and this is a photograph that I actually paid a woman $10 for the rights to this photograph from a shop here in Astoria. The fire is where this talk came from, but the talk started because I was hired as part of a freelance writing team to rebrand the Commodore Hotel. How many of you are familiar with the Commodore Hotel down in 14th Commercial? Right. The Commodore Hotel was opened in 2009 after having been closed for 40 years, and it was just shut up. And this was a photograph from when the new owners actually bought it, and they went in and they just found that it was just basically, they just closed the doors and walked away and left a bunch of stuff in it. 2009 was not a great year for real estate development, if some of you remember. And so at the 5-year anniversary of the reopening and rebranding of the Commodore Hotel, I was part of a PR team that was supposed to rebrand it. And we came out here, and one of the great things about working as a freelance writer for products is that you get those products, and sometimes those products aren't great. When it's a hotel, you get to go stay in that hotel. Which was fantastic, and I got to come to Astoria a lot in the fall of 2014 and the winter of 2015 and stay at the Commodore Hotel. One of the things that we decided to do was to really lean into the historical nature, not only of the Commodore Hotel and the building, but the historical nature of the city, Astoria, which I learned at that time is pronounced Astoria, not Astoria. And I still am about 50% on my ability to pronounce it correctly. As a Flatlander, I hope that you'll excuse my incorrect pronunciations. For those of you who are new to Astoria, this is going to be part of your training as well, is how to say it correctly, because you need to be able to say it correctly to be taken seriously in this town, as I learned in the fall of 2014. One of the things that we decided to do was to produce a coffee table book-like newspaper, which was actually printed by the Daily Historian printers and I'm down to maybe, this is the only one copy I have left, and I'm going to give it to the library. I brought a stack of them, and I gave them all away on Thursday. I have a small stack still at home. But this is all based on real articles from newspapers that I just basically found on the microfiche and reprinted, photographs. There's ads. As you can see, these ads are all legitimate facsimiles. It was intended to tell the history of Astoria in a newspaper. And I was the one tasked with doing this because on the PR team, I was the only one who actually knew anything about historical research. Plus, it was fun. So I learned a ton about this very interesting, very history-saturated city. I can hardly believe that Astoria is only 10,000 people, and at its peak in 1920, it was 14,000 people. It has the history of a city of more like 500,000 or a million people, and I think it's because it's actually all the ghosts are still alive, right? So while the current population is only about 10,000, really walking around, there are probably 400,000 or 500,000 souls in this town. So the Astoria Daily Record, as we called it, was the sort of result of scattershot historical research that I did in town just to kind of put it together. And I will tell you this, I've forgotten so much. As I was preparing for this talk, I was just like, okay, you have to focus on the fire and the Klan. And I was like, oh God, I've forgotten so much of the history of the city. The other night even, I think I misspoke and said the previous Great Fire was in 1877, which is 100% incorrect. It was in 1883, right? Yeah, who knows? Yeah. Anyway, I would, and I also referred to LeGrand as LaGrange. I came in Thursday less prepared. I spent most of yesterday refreshing my history. So today's talk is really going to be just a tiny slice of the very rich and crazy and amazing and diverse history of this city. The reason why I know this much about the Klan is because of a present my wife gave me for Christmas that year, which was a novel writing class, which was going to take place in the spring of 2015. And the purpose of this class, it was essentially a boot camp. You were supposed to come to class with nothing, and you were going to spend 8 weeks, and you were going to produce a novel at the end of it. And so you weren't supposed to start any writing, but you were allowed to start thinking. And so I was like, well, I'm going to have to write a historical novel set in Astoria sometime because it was so fresh in my mind. When I began thinking about what I would center this story on, because there's so many choices, I remembered something I heard while I was researching the Daily Record. A tattoo-covered Portland transplant, potentially in the audience today, I don't know if there's anybody covered in tattoos, said to me at a bar, it was actually a woman, so it wasn't you, but said to me at a bar that the Klan mayor burned down the city. And this was the kind of thing I heard all the time, because one of the other things I did in my research was I tried to drink at every bar in downtown Astoria and listen to the people tell stories, because Astorians are awesome historical storytellers. And I remembered that, and I thought, well, that's a great setting for a story. But as my historian side, I actually tried to validate that, and that is not proven to be true. I can't say it's not true. I have not disproven it. The Great Fire of 1922 was determined to have been a result of separate incidences of arson, as well as essentially the unintentional spread of the fire in an underground conduit of tunnels that were left under Astoria when it was rebuilt after the previous fire because of corruption and incompetence. Instead of rebuilding the town and filling in these conduits which had allowed the first fire to spread, they basically just rebuilt the town and left the fire corridor conduits in place. So nobody knows, it was never proven who started the fires, whether it was Klan-oriented or not. But that was a great topic for a novel. And here's the fire, and here's the area that was destroyed by the fire. Quite significant. One of the things that's absolutely true, though, about the relationship of this fire to the Klan is that it was a pivotal moment in the development of the Astoria Ku Klux Klan chapter. The Klan came to Oregon in 1921. It came to Astoria at the very beginning of 1922, grew quickly and developed, and by the November elections of 1922, less than a year after its initial arrival, the Klan had had basically won the citywide elections by electing a Klan-backed mayor, city council, school board, and I'll talk a little bit later about how successful the Klan was politically in the state of Oregon in the year 1922. Pretty much a month to the day after that election, the city burned to the ground. And this is a pivotal moment because on January 1st, 1923, the new administration was taking office with a destroyed downtown city and also, incidentally, a brand new form of government. In 1922, in the spring of 1922, in the May primary election, the voters of Astoria approved a city charter revision creating a council-manager system of government. Under the old system, basically the city council also ran the city government. That form of government was being replaced sort of progressively throughout America in the teens and into the 1920s because it was relatively corrupt. It was easy for political machines to turn that kind of political power into essentially corrupt control over the city administration. The council manager form was a progressive reform designed to have a professional city manager run the administration of the city while the political officials, the public officials elected, were essentially just setting policy and setting the budget. So Astoria had, starting in 1922, the Klan rises to prominence. I'll talk more specifically a little bit about how that happened. Wins the citywide election, the city burns to the ground, and then the Klan-backed city administration takes over in a brand new form of government. So that's a lot going on. It's a very transformative set of facts. The fire, whether it was started by the Klan or not, was a huge opportunity for the new administration. You essentially have a blank slate. I mean, it's a pretty ugly slate, but it's a blank slate. And you have undisputed control over the city government. Huge opportunities like this are also crises for leadership. And I would say much as the pandemic turned out to be a huge opportunity and a crisis of leadership for our previous president, I think there's a similarity here to the Great Fire of 1922 and what it presented to the city of Astoria as well as the new administration. I'm going to go back and show you the beginning of the Klan's presence in Astoria. Wednesday and Thursday, January 25th and 26th, 1922, the Klan put on a show at the Astoria Theater. 75 cents is about $13 in present-day money. So this was a relatively movie-priced type of event, not inexpensive, but also not prohibitively expensive. Presumably a money-making opportunity for the Klan. This is one of the ads, and I'll show you in a future slide one of the other ads that appeared in the other newspaper. This is one of the ads that appeared in an Astoria newspaper to generate an audience. 2 shows, 2 nights in a row. So they expected a large audience. They got a large audience. Before I trace the rise of the Klan in Astoria in 1922, I want to go back just a little bit and talk about where the Klan came from in the 1920s. Originally, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 to do terrorizing of emancipated slaves in the Reconstruction era South. The KKK was an unorganized band of racist terrorists who went around wearing burlap sacks over their heads and bed sheets and various kinds of clothing. There was no real uniform. There was no central organization. There were no rituals. It was essentially volunteer racist terrorists running around the South with a loose affiliation and a name. By the end of the 1870s, the original, now sometimes called by historians the first Klan, was more or less eradicated because one, the U.S. government during the early 1870s, under the leadership of President Grant, had used military power to try to crush this organization. But after 1876, when the federal troops left the South, essentially abandoning the emancipated slaves to a new white power structure, the need for the Klan disappeared because the official white governments of these formerly Confederate states were now actually doing a pretty decent job of terrorizing and disenfranchising Southern blacks. So the Klan served a brief purpose, served a purpose for a brief period of time. Did succeed at being a well-known and feared racist terrorist organization, but it more or less died out until 1915. And it's kind of hard to see this in this light, but this is the movie poster for D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915. Birth of a Nation was, if not the first feature-length film in cinema history, it was the first one that received wide distribution and a wide viewership. It's really no exaggeration to say that it was the first big blockbuster movie in cinema history. And the movie centered on a bunch of heroic white Southerners rescuing the area, rescuing the South from being overrun by carpetbaggers and unruly black people. The filmmaker, D.W. Griffith, his father was originally a member of the Klan back in Tennessee. And Griffith said in an interview after the film was released, quote, "The Klan at that time was needed and served a purpose." Now, he was essentially making a historical film because the Klan didn't exist anymore in 1915, and it had never existed in the form in which D.W. Griffith presented it. Because one of the things that he does is, as you can see on the movie poster, the horse has a uniform, the rider has a uniform, there's a logo. None of that existed in the Klan's history until it was created by D.W. Griffith's costume designer, who realized it was a black and white film too, right? So you needed to have high contrast stuff. In order to create a sort of visual impression for this nascent art form, the feature-length movie, Griffith's costume designer invented what is now familiar to practically every American and probably people outside of the United States as the Klan uniform. This was not a representation of something that existed. This was a Hollywood costume designer. Later in 1915, not too long after the release of the movie, the Klan was revived and reorganized under the marketing-savvy leadership of a guy named William Simmons, who was based in Atlanta, Georgia. He proclaimed himself Imperial Wizard of the Invisible Empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, a thing that didn't exist until William Simmons cooked it up. He'd seen the movie. He was intimately familiar with the iconography and the costumes and the sort of heroic stylistics that Griffith had portrayed the Klan as in his movie. And so he systematized the Klan. William Simmons essentially invented the Ku Klux Klan as we now know it out of a Hollywood depiction of something that never looked like Hollywood depicted it. And he created something that never existed before. A hierarchical national organization with a familiar look. He established titles and rituals and codes and all of the regalia that included this now familiar thing. It was also deeply saturated with K-oriented words, which is one of the weird features of the Klan, is that it just K's everywhere. The Kloran is the white book of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Character, Honor, Duty, K Uno. I've read this book, and it's full of crazy nonsense. It's practically unreadable because it's all these rituals and it's K sloganed, all kinds of stuff. But William Simmons modeled the Klan after a bunch of different fraternal organizations: the Masons, the Elks, the Sons of Norway, the Finnish Brotherhood. These organizations were all becoming very large in the early 20th century in the United States. And Simmons modeled the look of the Klan after Griffith's film. And as you can see, the logo, and we'll see this logo again, is the same. It's exactly, he just ripped it off, right? He basically went to the internet and cut and pasted the logo onto his book, right? He didn't do that. He just actually had somebody draw a new version of it. Didn't even bother to flip it around or change it in any way, shape, or form. So you can see how much Hollywood film, actually, excuse me, I don't think Griffith made it in Hollywood. A blockbuster film was translated into an image for the Klan. The offices of local Klansmen, this is cut and pasted from my book. These are actually what they were called. The local president of the local chapter was the exalted Cyclops. Everyone else was some weird thing, the Clalif, the Clegrap, the Clavy, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing these correctly, the Clud, Clad, and Clarogo. This ridiculousness to us, I would say, from our contemporary perspective, I think only just helped emphasize that this was an organization that was serious, it was organized, it was focused, it was themey, right? And so this was all part of William Simmons', I would say, very marketing savvy approach. He also created a hierarchical commission system for recruiting. Here is an application for citizenship in the invisible empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and this was your receipt, right? And you can't read it, but essentially you had to pay $10 to a recruiter, and then you got your little slip of paper, which you brought to the next meeting, and then you would be accepted, and then in the following meeting after that, you would be inducted into the Ku Klux Klan. I actually have an image of one that was issued here in Astoria several days before that first performance. So the Klan was already recruiting people in Astoria in early to mid-January with this form and this receipt. $10 admission, which was something like $175 or $180 in current money, so not nothing, but also not necessarily prohibitive enough, sort of a financial barrier to entry. The recruiter got somewhere between 20 and 50% of that, depending on their arrangement with the National Klan organization. Klan membership also, like all of these fraternal orders, involved monthly dues. The Klan regalia that was required to be purchased had to be bought from the national organization. William Simmons established a catalog and a mail order system and a national distribution system for these costumes. It was essentially a genius business model, not unlike a sort of combination of the way the mafia works and the way a subscription system works. And kind of a nationally franchised organization. The way it worked was you paid your $10, half of that went to the recruiter, half of that went to the local organization, but all of the money that went to the local chapter, the Astoria chapter of the Klan, some of that money would roll uphill to the state level, and some of the state level money would roll uphill to the national level. As the mafia says, they would dip their beak in it. Right, that's how the higher-ups would get their money. So it was a very ingenious revenue model. It was a great business model. Sales of robes and regalia and all of the other trappings, the flags, the crosses that were burned, all of that was centralized in the national organization. One of the other things that was done is that there was a very sophisticated marketing operation that included visiting churches, as well as going to those shows like the one I showed you advertised. They had minstrel shows. They of course had films. They did speeches. It was a very concerted, systematic recruiting and promoting effort that all came from Atlanta and went out into the various states. Now, the Klan wasn't big in every state in the United States. The three biggest states for the Klan outside of the South, the Deep South, the traditional home of the racist terrorist organization, were Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon. Those states don't have a whole lot in common, but the Klan was able to find a receptive audience in each one of those places. The second Klan, as historians have started to call the version that arose in 1915, enlisted somewhere between 4 and 5 million members nationwide. This is in a country that in 1920 had 100 million people, right? 4 to 5% of the population of the United States, which would have been a significantly larger percentage of the eligible population, because to be a member of the Klan, you had to be a man, you had to be white, you had to be Protestant, and you had to be native born. And so of those 100 million people, maybe 25 million fit the Klan requirements. And so something like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 eligible members nationwide joined the Klan. Now, I've seen various estimates. Some say that it was never higher than 1 million. Others say that it went as high as 8 million. It's impossible to know exactly how many people joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. But it was somewhere between 1 and 8 million people. And the most sort of, I would say the best estimates I've seen say 4 or 5. This is a march on Washington in 1925. The Klan leadership marched from the Capitol building down Pennsylvania Avenue in full regalia and received very flattering coverage in the national news and the local news press at the time. This is one of the pictures that was published in a newspaper with captions that said something like, a very orderly and reform-oriented group of people. Right? These are just nice fellows walking around trying to make the world a better place. The Klan came to Oregon in the spring of 1921. This is a image of a march through downtown Ashland. The primary figure in the Astoria Klan's rise was a guy named Luther Powell. He was a recruiter who began in Medford, which is at the southern end of the state, one of Oregon's many second largest cities, of which Astoria is one of them, Portland being the first largest, and then Medford, Ashland, LeGrand, Astoria, Bend, these are all kind of considered the second largest cities. They were all roughly the same size and undergoing similar growth patterns in the early 1920s. Powell sold the Klan to people in Oregon, not as a brotherhood of bigotry or racist hatred. At the time, there were virtually no black people in Oregon at all, thanks to our racist Oregon Constitution, about which probably many of you know a whole lot. In the 1920 census for Astoria, there were 14,000 residents, the high watermark for the population of this city. There were 8 black people. 8, right? Single-digit number of black people. So the Klan wasn't about racism. Powell actually made it about patriotism, cultural conservatism, and social order, right? According to Powell, the Klan was there to uphold traditional American society against the threats that were facing America at the beginning of the Roaring '20s. Immigration, technology, women's rights. Specifically, Powell emphasized the Klan's support for the enforcement of prohibition. Prohibition began in Oregon in 1916, just ahead of the national experiment with prohibition. And I wish that the country had waited for Oregon's experiment with prohibition to play out a little bit more, because if the rest of the country had waited, they probably would have realized that it was a disastrous social experiment that succeeded only in turning millions of Americans into criminals and creating an opportunity for organized crime to have a gigantic revenue stream and to establish itself with all kinds of political as well as economic and in many places cultural power. The Klan positioned itself as a protector of society and as a social reform movement. Within weeks of arriving in Medford, Powell had sworn in over 100 new members, many of whom were police officers. And it was just these kinds of solid citizens who were initially the target for recruitment in Oregon. Now, this is one of the things that fascinated me as soon as I began learning about the Second Klan and having seen that in Astoria, a city of 14,000 people with maybe 3,000 eligible males, based on my analysis of the census data, the Klan here allegedly got to about 900 members. Again, roughly 1 in 4 eligible adults. That's a lot of people who weren't necessarily not racists, but there were 8 black people in Astoria, so they weren't really necessarily being racists as they walked around. Who were these men? What were they like? What were their motivations for joining? Like any big movement that essentially comes out of nowhere, there were certainly multiple motivations for different people joining the Klan. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, Invisible Empire, is because I was fascinated by the history of this, but I was also fascinated by the idea of all of these men and their stories. Why did they join? And I try to depict in a way that I hope is not necessarily doing what D.W. Griffith did for the Klan, which is making it seem like a heroic organization, but I try to depict the various motivations as being understandable or plausible. Because personally, I had to make sense out of this myself. How did so many people join what was really originally a racist terrorist organization? Well, in Oregon, Luther Powell was undoubtedly one of the big forces for forming the sort of PR message that brought a lot of people in. So Powell had a lot of success in Medford. He moved north. By July, he was in Portland, Oregon. And by the end of 1921, Powell had helped organize the Portland chapter, and the Truth About the Ku Klux Klan rally that was held in Portland on December 22nd, 1921, drew 6,000 people to the Portland Municipal Auditorium, the brand new Portland Municipal Auditorium, including the mayor of Portland. Local and state papers advertised the speech as the new Klan's official introduction to the people of Oregon. The speaker was a guy named Reuben Sawyer, who was he was a local pastor who Powell had drawn into the movement and who was a better speaker than Powell. To begin his lecture, Sawyer accused the American news media of gravely misrepresenting the Klan, right? So he came out and called fake news on the media, and he said that they were misrepresenting the Klan as a wild, dangerous mob committing deeds of violence and lawlessness. Sawyer assured the crowd that the Klan was truly, quote, an institution of chivalry, humanity, justice, and patriotism. Law-abiding citizens would be respected, he said, quote, irrespective of race, religion, or color, so long as they make an honest effort to be Americans and Americans only. Right? And that was the Klan's real message. They weren't against black people, they weren't against immigrants, they weren't against Jews, they weren't against Catholics. They were against people who were un-American, anti-American, non-American. That was their pitch. Now, of course, they went on to very successfully demonize and attack all of these groups as being un-American. But the way in which the message was framed was you needed to be American and American only. Membership in Oregon topped out at about 24,000. Again, these are all estimates. 24,000 people, with about 15,000 in Portland, and chapters in at least a half a dozen different cities throughout Oregon, from Medford to Ashland, LeGrand, Astoria, Bend, etc. That's a lot of people in a state that was actually relatively small at the time. Here is the photograph that appeared in a Portland newspaper showing the political leadership of Portland meeting with the ghostly figures of the Ku Klux Klan. Rapid success in a very short period of time. 1922 election, statewide, William Pierce was the Democratic candidate for governor. He was overtly endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. After the candidate they backed for the Republican nomination was defeated to the incumbent Ben Olcott. So Benjamin Olcott was the Secretary of State in Oregon, elected in 1918, and the governor who was elected died soon after he took office, and Olcott, according to the state constitution at the time, took over as governor. He ran for re-election. He won the Republican nomination, barely, beating out a guy named Charles Hall, who was a state senator who was backed by the Klan. When they didn't win the Republican nomination, they turned to the Democratic nominee, and Walter Pierce, and he's a very stern-looking dude. He scares me just to look at him. He got the Klan's support when he promised to back the compulsory public education bill, which was known as Measure 6. Measure 6, this is a political cartoon that actually sort of demonizes Measure 6. Measure 6 required children between 8 and 16 to attend public school. It would have been would have started in September of 1926, but it was overturned by the United States Supreme Court in 1925 as basically being an unconstitutional invasion of freedom of religion. Why a compulsory education bill? Catholic schools were huge in Oregon, and according to the Klan, they were being educated in un-American ways. They were being educated to follow the Pope, not the President. They were being educated to follow Catholic doctrine, not the U.S. Constitution. So the compulsory education bill was actually a direct attack on the Catholic Church and the system of Catholic education in Oregon. It passed with a 52.7% yes vote the year that it came up. So that was 1922. Walter Pierce won with 57% of the vote, which in Democratic politics is a landslide. He won by 15 points, backed by the Klan, and he was backed by the Klan because he backed the compulsory education bill. Now, I will point out that Pierce ran for re-election in 1926, and he lost. The compulsory education, or the public education bill, was repealed by the Supreme Court. Otherwise, it probably would have been repealed by ballot measure. So within that 4-year period, the Klan declined significantly statewide. Okay, so much for the background. I'm trying to go quickly here, but I'm never quick. Back to Astoria. Here is the other ad. It's kind of hard to tell. This one's a little grainier, but this was the ad that appeared in the other newspaper. January 25th and 26th, the Klan makes its first public presentation. Here is, and it's hard to see, but this is January 24th, 1922. This is a guy named Anderson who joined the newly formed Astoria Klan. There's his ticket. Right? There's he made his $10 donation. So the Klan was here already just before their public presentation, and the Klan moved very quickly. On March 13th, the local Klan made its first public appearance at a Methodist church to make a donation to the church, and this is one of the ways that they worked. You saw the picture earlier, the Jesus Saves picture. That was in Portland. The same thing happened in all of the cities in which the Klan tried to recruit. On April 6th, the Morning Astorian happily reported that as the weather improved, the Klan would begin holding outdoor meetings for all to see. And the Klan's visibility in supporting local charities helped its membership to surge. May 5th, the Klan made a donation to a local temperance group. I have the headline right here. 5 masked Klansmen give money toward work of temperance. This is how they worked. This is the way they presented themselves, as good-hearted social reformers. Later that spring, I should say, this is hard to read, but the Klan sent a letter to the Clatsop County Sheriff saying, and I'll read from here, the conditions in Clatsop County relative to the ruthless, open, and repeated violations of state and federal prohibition laws have reached the point where they are a disgrace to the county, state, and nation. If you do not take immediate steps to clean out the so-called Whistle Inn, located near Flavel, as well as several other joints in the county almost as bad, this organization will take prompt and drastic action, not only to clean out some of these violators of the law, but also to clean out some of the county offices that are in a measure responsible by their passive attitude and indifference toward the performance of their sworn duty for the terrible conditions that exist in Clatsop County at the present time. Yours for active law enforcement, Pacific Klan No. 2, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. They sent that letter to the sheriff, and then the next day, they showed up at the Whistle Inn to do their vigilante work. And so this was the second stage. The first stage was public presentations. The second stage was very public acts of charity. The third stage was just showing their presence physically by marching in public. And the fourth stage was active vigilantism against corrupt officials and violators of the law, speakeasies, basically. On July 1st, Klansmen visiting from Portland helped the Astoria Klan initiate 250 new members in a massive public ceremony that was followed by a march through downtown. So this number is known because it was actually a public demonstration, and it was reported in the newspaper as having 200 new members. This is July 1st. This is 6 months after, or 6.5 months after first arriving in Astoria. On August 11th, the Klan sponsored a successful recall of the Clatsop County Sheriff, who was the target of this letter and who was clearly a guy who was on the take. It was easy for the Klan to find corruption and target that corruption because there was corruption everywhere. So what they were fighting against existed. They leaned hard into their work as social reformers, as upholders of law and order, and only kind of had their bigotry and racism on the side. Here's a picture of Merle Chessman, and this guy looks exactly like I think that he must have been. He looks very buckled down, very austere, very serious. Merle Chessman was the editor of the Astoria Evening Budget throughout this entire period, and in fact, until 1942, when he left the paper because he was appointed to fill a vacancy in the Oregon State Senate. He was a good guy. He was one of the new generation of newspaper editors who were post-yellow journalism. This was a group of progressive reformers who saw newspapers' role as promoting a healthy civic discourse, as performing an important public service in making sure that corruption was rooted out in government, that good causes were publicized, and that the truth was told in an objective and accurate manner. So he was the beginning of a new breed of newspapermen that would create people like Walter Cronkite, who essentially all looked just like this guy. They were all these college-educated, upper middle class, middle-aged white men. But Merle Chessman was the editor of one of the two major newspapers in Astoria at the time. When the Klan first arrived, he was very concerned and very dubious. His editorial on January 27th, which was the day after the second of the two presentations, he had a very long editorial which concluded in this way. It is the inherent right of any person to join the Ku Klux Klan if he so wishes and can gain admission. It is his personal privilege in this land of freedom. We do not and will not question this right, but we can and do question the expediency, the propriety, and the judgment of supporting an organization which, by the very nature of its activities, cannot but become a disturbing and disruptive factor in the community, a creator of discord and distrust. As a prediction, that was about 100% spot on. Now, notice the language that he uses, that is the inherent right of any person to join the Klan. He Merle Chessman very much believes in American freedoms. And he did become, throughout the spring and summer of 1922, a cautious supporter of the local Klan, as his newspaper reported on the charitable and then political activities. He was worried about the vigilantism, but he was hopeful that the Klan's energies could be channeled in a positive direction. One of the things that was happening in the summer of 1922 is that the Klan was deciding who it was going to nominate and support for citywide offices in the upcoming city elections, which by that time everybody knew there was a new form of government coming, and that the mayor would appoint the city manager and the city council would approve that. So everybody knew what was going on. The Klan was debating internally who to nominate. And at this time, there were a number of prominent figures in civic life in Astoria who were members. The president of the Oregon Klan, the Cyclops, was a prominent local businessman. And there was hope that the Klan would nominate a clean, reform-minded ticket. And that's what Merle Chessman was both pushing for and hoping for. What ended up happening is that at the end of August, after a pretty, from what I can tell from the newspaper accounts, a pretty contentious internal debate, the Klan actually nominated a guy named O.B. Setters for mayor. And he was not one of the clean, reform-minded people. He was a sort of a very strongly bigoted, angry, radicalized member of the Klan. So the Klan already had at least two different factions. It had the radicalized faction and the more moderate faction. Merle Chessman was pushing for the more moderate, reform-minded faction to do what Luther Powell had promised back when he brought the Klan to Oregon in the first place, which was to essentially clean up the city and to do so in a sort of orderly and law-abiding way. The victory of O.B. Setters in the nominating contest, and then later in the election, showed Chessman that the Klan was actually only going to be a force for discord and disarray. Enter O.A. Kratz. O.A. Kratz, at the time that he was appointed to be the brand new and first city manager of the city of Astoria, he was the city manager for LeGrand, which is a city of about 7,000. And he was making $3,600, which in today's money would be about $65,000. So he was a decently upper middle class technocrat. This notice is from the city manager bulletin, which Kratz absolutely was a subscriber to. These are from two different times. Manager Kratz of LeGrand advises that in the following Oregon City city manager campaigns are being waged: Portland, Astoria, Baker Bend, Newport, Tillamook, and St. Helens. So Kratz is the city manager of LeGrand. He has his eye on Astoria. He knows it's being elected here. Portland actually didn't pass their city manager form of government until this year, 100 years after it was first proposed. For those of you who are following politics in Oregon, I was actually a supporter of that measure in Portland. So Kratz was like Merle Chessman, he was sort of a new generation of progressive reformers. He was a technocrat. He was educated at the Michigan Agricultural College, which later became Michigan State University. He studied engineering and urban planning. He went on to be the city engineer for Portland before he ended up being the city manager of LeGrand. He was, from what I can tell, and I'm going to tell his story at sort of a bit of length here because he's a pivotal character in this whole story, he was an ambitious, well-educated technocrat. He was one of those scientifically minded do-gooders of the progressive era who, in a sort of the complementary figure to the Merle Chessmans of the world, the first generation of urban planners, city managers, elite technocrats who were going to bring rationality, science, and objective decision-making to governance. That's who he was. And this is the only picture I could find of him, and that's actually, unfortunately, a picture from his grave. He did not appear in any newspaper photographs that I could find. It's possible that he's there. How did Kratz get appointed? Well, here's a notice. It's hard to read, but I'll read it from here. This is December 27th, 1922, which is 3 weeks after the fire. Astoria's newly elected city commission will hold its first meeting on Monday morning to organize and announce the personnel of the city force. While neither O.B. Setters, mayor-elect, nor the commissioners will confirm or deny the report, it is understood unofficially that the city manager will be O.A. Kratz, who recently resigned as manager of LeGrand. So O.A. Kratz manages to get himself appointed the city manager of a city twice the size of the one he was managing before. And how did he do that? Well, it's pretty obvious to me how he did it. These are reproduced entries from a book called Clavern, The Secret History of a Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, which was published in 1980. It's a historical document that was found by a guy whose father was a member of the Oregon Klan and who kept the minutes of that organization when it existed in 1922 and 1923 in his safe. And when he died, the son discovered it and published it. And these are 3 of the entries. And the minutes, the whole book is just all the minutes, and it's very, very boring. I mean, imagine me reading the minutes of a Mason Lodge set of meetings. But it shows who was involved and what they did. These 4 entries are the only ones in which O.A. Kratz is mentioned. December 5th, after approving the membership of city manager Oscar A. Kratz and 6 others, the Clavern inducted 10 new Klansmen. December 5th. It's before the fire, but it's after the election. We know that O.A. Kratz is aware of the fact that Astoria was considering the city manager form. He certainly was aware that it passed, and now he joins the Klan soon after the Klan dominates the election. December 19th, he was approved, or he was inducted. I'm sure he had his little receipt, and he showed up at the meeting, and they inducted him. This is from the minutes of the next monthly meeting, because probably they, didn't meet a whole lot around Christmas. One day after his induction, Klansman Oscar A. Kratz announces his resignation as LeGrand city manager, and soon assumed the same post in Astoria. Right? So he joins the Klan, and then he quits his job as city manager, and then, as we know from the previous clipping, on December 27th, he was brought to Astoria and is going to be approved as the city manager. Now, this final notice: former city manager Kratz, the object of Klan derision, had displeased Grand Dragon Gifford, who was the head of the Oregon organization, by refusing to cooperate with patronage appointments in his new position in Astoria. And I will move to the next slide, because here's what happens to O.A. Kratz. He immediately, after taking office, goes to battle with his with the elected officials of the city. And this is Merle Chessman's newspaper, and this is the headline on March 17th, 1923, which is just spilling out the open warfare between OA Kratz and the Klan administration, the Klan elected officials. Now, here's the thing. Kratz is a Klansman, but he's going to battle with them. Why was he a Klansman? It seems obvious to me that he joined because he was professionally ambitious, and he knew that the way he was going to get this job is by joining the Klan. That's one of the types of people that joined the Klan, were people who were professionally ambitious. Why did O.B. Setters join the Klan? Probably because he was an opportunist, ambitious economically, and he knew that he could ride this organization into political power, and that political power tended to mean benefits, public contracts, kickbacks, all kinds of sources of corrupt income. Kratz immediately, within 3 months of becoming city manager, goes to battle. Why can Kratz do this? Because he was appointed and approved, and now they can't get rid of him. Except they try, because Oregon also has a recall. As we know, that the Klan was able to recall the sheriff. Part of the spread of direct democracy through Oregon in the early 20th century was the initiative, also the recall. The Klan organizes a recall election to get rid of Kratz, and it fails. And why did it fail? The reason it failed is that O.A. Kratz was doing what the voters of Astoria and what the people of the city, as well as people of Oregon, wanted to be done. He was cleaning things up. The city was devastated, remember. I don't want to lose track of that, right? This is his article from Concrete Highway magazine, August 1924, Unusual Street Construction Problems in Astoria Solved by Concrete. And it's actually a deeply fascinating treatise on char walls, concrete char walls. Essentially, Kratz was figuring out how to rebuild the city in a way that it wouldn't burn down again, that was along thoroughly modern, rational, scientific lines. They put in all kinds of great conduits that were fireproof, that were for not only present utilities, but for future utilities. He was essentially extremely good at his job. And in order to be good at his job, he had to fight Klan patronage. This is what brought down the Klan in Astoria. It's what brought down the Klan in Portland. It's what brought down the Klan Oregon-wide, is that whatever the basic membership of the organization really was, whatever motivations got those 900 members to join, the 15,000 members in Portland to join, the millions nationwide, there was at least one cohort of opportunistic and corrupt people who joined the Klan to make use of this organization to gain political power to enrich themselves. It happened in Portland. There's actually a sort of more complex story about corruption in Portland. Here it was very clear. The new administration basically said to Kratz, give public contracts, give jobs to Klan-backed individuals and organizations, essentially be corrupt in behalf of our supporters. And Kratz actually said, no, I think that what I really want to do is do the job that I was trained to do and to rebuild the city along thoroughly modern lines. And that's what he ends up doing. This is an ad from later in the 20s. We have faith in Astoria, the city of the future. And this is the city of today, which is, it's kind of hard to see in this, but it looks pretty much like Commercial Street. And then this is the city that they envisioned. Kratz initiates a very optimistic period of modern development. And in fact now, here it is, we're in it. We are at the very sort of northern edge of the downtown historical district, which existed only because the fire wiped out the previous historical district, and Kratz was able to rebuild. As you walk down the various streets around here, you see that the buildings were built in 1923, 1924, 1926. Kratz actually was the driving force for this. He ended up leaving the job of city manager in Astoria in 1926 when he got a job as the city manager of Dubuque, Iowa, which had a population at the time of 40,000. So he leaped up. He eventually got another job in a larger city in Iowa, and then unfortunately he died in his early 50s. It seems, probably from what I could tell, probably just from a heart attack. It's hard to know. But O.A. Kratz was the savior of Astoria in the post-fire period. He also was the one who led essentially the outing of the Klan's political leadership in 1923. By 1926, the Klan had more or less dissolved. They did request to change their charter and cut their ties with the National Klan organization. And so the Astoria Klan didn't disappear, but they rewrote their charter to be locally oriented only. They cut themselves off from the revenue stream, sending money through Portland and into Atlanta. But their attempt to reform themselves didn't work because OB senators and everybody on the city council lost their re-elections. And the Klan was basically, while it might not have 100% disappeared from the city, it was gone from its political power base. To me, the real hero is, the two heroes are Merle Chessman and O.A. Kratz, who were the ones who went to battle against this force, exposed them, and went about the business of turning Astoria into the modern city that it would become. And here's a picture. I think this is from, is the date on here? 1926, maybe 1928, showing the downtown Astoria. That's my talk.